Good morning. I'm Deb Wake, the president of the League of Women Voters of Virginia. Welcome to our Women's Legislative Roundtable, also known as WLRT. We're so happy to have you with us this morning, and I'm going to kick it right off to Denise Harrington, our Advocacy Director.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much, Deb. So this is a good morning for everybody, and I see that our very first speaker is already here. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth D. Shimek, Senior Legal Counsel, Campaign Finance. Thank you, Elizabeth. You can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. It's great to be here and talking to all of you today. As you said, my name is Beth Shimek. I'm the Senior Legal Counsel for Campaign Finance at the Campaign Legal Center, and I specialize in state and local campaign finance reform. For those who are not familiar with us, CLC is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to protecting and strengthening democracy through law at all levels of our government. Our work promotes every citizen's right to participate in an accountable, transparent democratic process, and we work in 4 large overarching issue areas, which are campaign finance, government ethics, voting rights, and redistricting. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. The League is a critical partner here in Virginia and across the country. And this morning, I'm happy to talk about 3 big areas of policy that we've seen as priorities in the last year, both in Virginia and across the country, and a major development in each area that we've seen over the last year. Hoping it'll be about 10 minutes of material, and I'm happy to take questions after if anybody has any. I'm going to kick it off with talking about contribution limits. I know that this is a big issue in Virginia that many of you have worked on for a number of years. Campaign contribution limits play an important role in protecting our democracy. They reduce undue influence of wealthy donors over politics, guard against political corruption, and ensure that our office holders are accountable to all citizens. The Supreme Court in Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976 distinguished that while expenditures cannot generally be limited, the money that goes out of a campaign contributions, that money coming into a campaign, can generally be subject to limits. And I've seen many states working to create or update their contribution limits over the last year. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but there are a lot of different sub-issues that you can address within contribution limits as a whole. Besides setting dollar limits, one of the major issues that's come up in contribution limit discussions is ensuring that the law accounts for coordinated expenditures. That's ensuring that expenditures that are coordinated with an outside spender and a candidate are treated as contributions to that candidate. Because coordinated spending is just as valuable to candidates as if you were to give them a direct contribution of cash, coordination between these outside spenders and their preferred candidates needs to be strictly policed to prevent big donors from indirectly bankrolling their preferred candidates while sidestepping those contribution limits. This is especially important because independent expenditures, truly independent expenditures that are made without coordination to a candidate cannot be limited, including by corporations after Citizens United. In recent years, we've seen super PACs and outside groups continually pushing the legal boundaries between coordinated and independent campaign spending. For example, single issue super PACs are often run by the favored candidate's former campaign staff or their political allies, or even sometimes family members who have intimate knowledge of that campaign's strategy and needs. We've also seen the rise of a practice called red boxing. Red boxing, and many of you may have heard of it, it made a lot of news stories within the last 6 months or so, is a form of illegal coordination that's actually taking place in plain sight, where candidates put specific directions, messaging, the demographics of people that they'd like a PAC to supposedly independently organize to about their candidacy, to advertise to about how great they are, using industry-specific code language, and they put it on their website in plain sight, using code words and clear signals that are easily overlooked by the general public, but are well known to industry insiders and big spenders. The name red boxing comes from, in the most egregious cases, there's often a literal red box that surrounds this information. In this past year, we've seen efforts to address this particular type of blatant coordination, including in Philadelphia, where the city's Board of Ethics enacted new regulations combating this illegal practice. So that was a really exciting change to see. Philadelphia took this really great first step of adding these new regulations so that they can clearly identify and prohibit, and then if someone does red box, punish someone for doing that. The second big area that we've seen developments in is stopping secret spending and disclosure. Voters have a right to know which wealthy special interests are spending money, often referred to as dark money in this secret spending, to influence our vote and our government and rig the political system in our favor. I know that this is an issue many of you are also well aware of. And ensuring that voters have the information about who is spending this big money is critical to our democratic process. We've seen in the last decade, between 2010 and 2020, independent and secret spending has exploded. In Virginia, I know this is a big issue, as in many states, and many states are looking for ways to increase that disclosure so voters know who's spending to influence their ballot. We've seen in Arizona, just in November, you may have heard, they passed Proposition 211, also known as the Voters' Right to Know Act. In a 2021 CLC report, Arizona's existing campaign finance disclosure system up until November was described as, quote, one of the most pro-dark money statutes imaginable. But in November, over 70% of voters approved this great initiative, which takes 3 big steps to improve disclosure and transparency. First, it traces back the source of big money spent in Arizona elections through intermediaries to the original source and requires spenders to report the original sources of the funds that they're spending. So that means that if I were a big donor, couldn't donate $50,000 to an LLC that gave it to a 501c4 that passed it along to Arizona's for Arizona that then spends that on big ads. If I did that, if I passed that along, that money would get traced through each step. And when the disclosure came, it would say that I had been the one who bankrolled that big spending. So that's a huge piece of progress. The second thing that the Voters' Right to Know Act did was top 3 donor disclosure. So now that we have this information, now that they've traced where that spending is coming from, the Citizens Clean Elections Commission is required to promulgate rules so that every ad that comes out with that money lists the top 3 original source donors. The third big piece of disclosure that comes from the Voters' Right to Know Act is what we call a donor opt-out provision. So with this big traceback that now exists with the top 3 donor disclosure, it's equally important for donors to know where their money is going. I might have donated money to People for Trees because I believe in reforestation. And under the current system in many states, I might donate that money and never know that People for Trees, in fact, passed it on to a PAC that's spent on elections. With the donor opt-out, if People for Trees wants to spend money that I as a donor provided on elections or pass that money on to be spent on elections, they have to tell me as a donor and get my permission, either at the time of donation or at the time that they want to spend it, to make sure that, if I say, actually, I just want to spend money on trees, I don't want to spend money on political ads, I can say, nope, that's not going to happen. So those are the 3 big things that Proposition 211 does to improve transparency in Arizona: original source traceback, top 3 donor disclosure on ads, and donor opt-out. The final place that I want to touch on, now speed it up because I see that I'm running out of time, is public financing of elections. Public financing of elections also saw a big year. It isn't a panacea, but it can be a really strong tool to strengthen our democracy and our state and local elections and amplify the voices of all citizens, diversify both the donor base and the number of candidates and kind of candidates running. So in Oakland, we saw the passage of Measure W, which is a Democracy Dollars voucher-based public financing program that empowers residents to engage in the political process by giving each eligible resident 4 $25 Democracy Dollars vouchers that they can donate to qualified city candidates of their choice. They can spread those between 4 candidates or give all 4 to a single candidate. And this we've seen in studies of a similar program in Seattle, diversifies the donor base, it increases candidate discussions with the local community, and it actually diversifies the number and kind of candidates who can afford to run for office. It increases this meaningful participation. So that's the third major development. I know in the local level, these successful programs we've often seen implemented by cities. I know in Virginia, this would require state authorization, but it has been a path forward in other states, including in Maryland. So this has been a really exciting year for campaign finance progress at the state and local level. We're seeing this strong interest in moving forward with disclosure, with campaign contribution rules, with public financing in the state and local level across the country and in Virginia. And with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you. We do have one in chat. Can you please provide the counter argument for those that say if the contributors were known, they would experience harassment or doxing?
Absolutely. So that is where we think the donor disclosure provision or the donor provision is really important. So if you don't want your money to be spent on political advertising, or you don't want your name to be out there as spending on political advertising, you can opt out from having your money spent on political advertising when you donate to these groups that are going to potentially spend. I think that's really important. The other thing to know is that the Supreme Court has consistently held that in cases where someone does have a real fear, there are real threats out there that they or their family might be subjected to physical harm, there have been exceptions made in those very specific, very serious circumstances.
A question came in privately. When you talk about red boxing,
yes,
there's something else that is like red boxing. So are there other things we should look for, or is that the most egregious, or are there other sneaky ways around, is what she's saying?
I think what I would say is campaigns and supposedly independent spenders who want to illegally coordinate, they do their best to find their way around the law. So as I said, you'll see situations where, someone might leave one job and immediately jump to a spender. Now, in many cases, that isn't technically illegal, but states are moving to make that more difficult. They're moving to say, if you have that close relationship where, say, you worked for a legislator and the next day you went and worked for that independent spender, that's a big place where states are looking to deal with that. But red boxing has been one of the stranger and more egregious forms of out in the open coordination that we've seen. There was a big case in Rhode Island just in this past election where I believe it was the Secretary of State had a literal red box on their website. So it was quite a story to see.
Denise, we have no more questions in chat. I'll throw it back to you.
All right, thank you so much. Well, thank you for reminding us why we are here in terms of campaign finance reform, and as well as making sure that we get some things done. Thank you again for a very informative. We are moving on. We are so happy. Delegate Watts has just come into the room, and we know her schedule is tight. And so right away, we're going to get to Delegate Watts. Please come on.
Thank you so much. The short session is really something else, and everything has to be done yesterday. Another quick anecdote. Over the years, I've said our legislative days are like somebody else's week. You keep on trying to remember, wait a minute, was that meeting this morning or was it last week? As we try to move through everything. But therefore, what is very important right up front, right now, because it's coming before the House Finance Committee, is the whole big tax reform package. This is $1 billion package being proposed of tax cuts. So what I want to highlight in my brief presentation are elements of both the need for $1 billion, not to be taken out of the stream permanently. Right now, the economics of the state are in such shape that we could say that we've got that surplus if we didn't want to meet longstanding needs. But we also aren't in a position to say that we will have it in future years, especially given long-term unmet needs. But then also what I will be emphasizing is progressivity. If you're going to cut taxes, we should be addressing those tax cuts to those who need it most. In other words, address it towards addressing ability to pay, which over at least the last 20 years, as there's been no real tax reform in Virginia, you look at what's been happening as the poor get poorer and the rich get richer throughout particularly the United States. And so our tax reform needs to address those economics as well, so that progressivity is more important than ever. So quickly outlining that $1 billion. And since it's $1 billion, it's kind of easy to see it in percentages. About 47% of it, of that $1 billion, will go to individuals, but it's heavily weighted towards the higher incomes, because 333 million, so 1/3 of that $1 billion, is going to be taken in lowering Virginia's tax rates. Now you would think, well, that benefits all of us. But if you lower them all, you're squeezing it, making it flatter and flatter, and more advantage to the higher income who are paying that much more at the upper rates. There is a study, an excellent study, which I would recommend, and having been a long time legal, that's where I got all my stuff about taxes. Look on the website, General Assembly, commissions, JLARC. They have just put out a study of the progressivity of the Virginia income tax. And you will see there very good charts under particularly the option, I'm looking at figure 442, which gives you, while it's in rather fine, it's showing that the more that you flatten, the more that the benefit goes towards the top and not towards the lower income, as opposed to another element of the tax cut package, which is a progressive element for individuals, which is to increase the standard deduction, continue that increase. And there you see the benefits occurring in the low and moderate income, flattening out as you get to the higher income. So that would be a good progressive change. However, it is only at a level to take 95 million as opposed to 333 million towards lowering the rates. But one other comment on lowering on the rates before I move on. The average top rate, or in the United States, is 6.5. Ours is currently 5.75. So we're already below average, and there's no need to go to 5.5 again, because it is not a progressive change. When it comes to business, which would be the other 53% of the tax cuts, they're in two groupings. 17% goes to what small businesses. Many small businesses, partnerships, S corps, etc., pay under the individual income tax. So there are a couple of provisions, the biggest one being $162 million, which reduces the amount of qualified business income that is taxed. I'm not going to go into the weeds on trying to explain this, but all I can say is only a couple of states do this. It's highly questionable whether or not there's enough track record, and again, how it affects small businesses. That one is, I'm going to say, to be determined. But the biggest one out of business is large business, which is the corporate tax cut. There are a few small CPAs that might have, for one reason, decide to incorporate, but most of your, basically we're talking about big business, and there the amount involved is $362 million a year loss of revenue. And again, a couple of quick points on this. Our rate is already 17th lowest in the nation. our corporate tax rate is not an issue in not attracting businesses. The biggest issue in not attracting businesses, manufacturers in particular, is not having site-ready places for them to come and establish their business as quickly as possible. They don't want 3 or 4 years of permitting and sewering and all of the other things. And this is where we have lost major manufacturing to some of the southern states, particularly Georgia. So this is where we need to put investments, but cutting the tax rate and reducing the amount of revenue that you have for those investments is not the way to solve the problem. The other quick thing that I will say about businesses, I spent considerable time in the last several years. For 2 years, I was chair of finance committee working on the corporate taxes. Won't get into details with unified combined reporting, But when I had at the table over 20 front office, major experienced tax lawyers for each one of these businesses in a task force that I put together, I asked them an open question, said, please, in writing, tell me the 2 things that are you like best about Virginia's business tax structure, what you like least. Not a single one of them talked about the corporate rate. They talked about specific things that we could change in how you account for certain expenses, et cetera, but not a single one of them did. So that this, quite frankly, is much more, I think, about politics than it is about the need. Now, let me just say one quick thing about the need, and I know my time is, I'm sure, more than short. I could go on and on and on about particularly K through 12, how I'm a numbers person. When it first came out, I didn't believe it when it was said that Virginia is at the bottom of all states in teacher salaries compared to comparable educational background in the state. And I think that's an excellent comparison because it's taking into account cost of living as well as the level of training and experience and education at the bottom. We have got to address that. Mental health, serious problems, whether we are talking about all the incentives that we need to do to get highly trained professionals to be able, both in our community services boards as well as in our hospitals, but also particularly in the hospitals, we need people on the floor. And if you open up an Amazon distribution center within 25 miles, you've lost half your staff because they pay more. One of the problems and it's actually safer, if you can believe that. One of the problems in approaching public finance, when you haven't been immersed into it, either through caring about what is paid for as well as how it's paid for, is that the vast majority of what government does is all about services. Yes, we build roads, but that's not general fund. But that's, and we build some college buildings now and again. That's not general fund. What our general fund does is very much over services, teachers, mental health, law enforcement. Let me digress for a second on law enforcement. Way back when I was cabinet secretary and had state police under me, typically a recruit had 1 or 2 years post high school education. Now recruit classes have GEDs. They can't get someone who's even had a high school 4-year discipline to get a standard diploma. They're not competitive salaries. But when you talk about competitive salaries, particularly now in times of inflation, we may make a salary adjustment as we did for teachers, but by the way, localities had to match it. And there's a whole nother thing on the school funding formula that I won't get into, but they had to match it. But that has been eaten up with inflation. And now, or Medicaid payments or nursing home payments, all of those things quickly get heated up by inflation. And it's another 6 months to 12 months before the budget cycle can make any kind of adjustment. So again, the competitive salaries are challenged repeatedly by the way in which salaries are funded, as well as the fact that when you're looking at our challenges, they're all in services to people who need to have our collective support of meeting both their current needs, I'm going to say mental health, public safety, or their future productivity and needs, education, mental health being two of them. And then I would be remiss if I didn't at least come out of my mouth the staffing standards of nursing homes, which I've been working on for 20 years. And the reason why it doesn't get funded, it doesn't get passed as minimum staffing standards, is because of funding. Thank you.
We really appreciate Delegate Watts' comments and insights into the budget, and we're always happy to see fellow leaguers come and tell us about what's really going on. So in the interest of brevity, we're going to hold your questions, if you will, because we've just had someone walk into the room who almost needs no introduction to the Williamsburg League. This is Senator Tommy Norment, was not able to come himself, but he has sent his very, very wonderful legislative assistant, Jeff Ryer. So would you please come on up and come on down?
I would have been more than happy to wait for Delegate Watts to get questions. I have lectured at Sorensen classes over the years, and one of the questions that they always like to ask is, can you name somebody who's a Democrat that you for whom you have a great deal of respect? And Delegate Watts is always the first on my list. And the reason why is I worked as House Press Secretary for about 10 years before I moved on to do Secretary for the Senate Republicans. And Delegate Watts, for those of you who watch the General Assembly sessions, speaks at length on a variety of issues in tremendous detail, and is probably better informed and better prepared than any other member of the House of Delegates. And she's going to be eventually, you know, I know that she won't be in the House any longer, and I don't see anybody that has that level of skill capable of replacing her. It's just an extraordinary ability and a grasp of knowledge and details. The topic that you all asked me to speak on this morning was campaign finance reform. And regrettably, I do not have a lot of good news for you. And in fact, just yesterday, the Senate P&E Committee heard two measures that Delegate Peterson had brought forward to create limits on campaign contributions. One would have limited campaign contributions and capped them at $20,000 for an individual or a company. And that was defeated by a vote of 10-5. And the second one is one that Delegate Peterson has brought up on, or Senator Peterson rather, has brought up on many different occasions. And that is to ban public utilities, those regulated by the state, from making campaign contributions. That was defeated by 12-3. Now, as you know, the Senate Privileges and Elections Committee does not have a Republican majority, so you can't blame me for these defeats. It was a bipartisan effort that shot these down. And in fact, the attempts at campaign finance reform in Virginia can best be described as fits and starts. During the course of the last 3 years, really, there's been a campaign finance reform commission that was due to prepare a report for the General Assembly on January 11th this year. Don't go looking online, there's no report. They met on multiple occasions listened to many proposals. And in fact, I know the league came forward with several at the inaugural meeting of the campaign finance reform study committee, essentially. And none of those were adopted and no consensus was reached. What does that leave us in a campaign finance world? Well, the one thing that tends to do a little bit better are disclosure requirements, and Virginia has made advancements in those over the last several years, as far as requiring contributions to be reported more quickly with comment with the state board and posted more quickly. We have, of course, we've always had or for some time, we've had the 24-hour period that goes into effect 10 days prior to an election, and that has been good at keeping track of it. Although I have to tell you, in the closing days of an election, keeping track of all of them is rather staggering. It's quite an undertaking, because they come in so quickly and there's so many of them, and you can really tell where the hot races are late in the game. But other reforms, as far as beyond the reporting level and beyond increasing the requirements for reports when people hit a certain level of contributions, PACs, transfers, things like that. All of these have been incorporated over the last several years. But anything that would place a cap on an individual contribution, anything that would cap a particular type of contribution, anything that would have any effect on any of those areas has not met with success. And in fact, none of these measures have even gotten out of the committee level in either chamber, even when whether it was one party rule for the Republicans, one party rule for the Democrats, or split rule. So campaign finance reform in Virginia, I would say, is moving at a glacial pace. And I cannot tell you that I would love to sit here and give you tons of optimism, but history tells me otherwise, and certainly the circumstance. Why, you might wonder, is this the case? Well, I think it's fairly straightforward. Campaigns, as most of us can tell, are getting more and more expensive and more costly. Take, for example, the special election we just had over in the 7th Senate District. A special election that took 8 weeks. Both parties will have spent over $1 million on that race. Not $1 million combined, over $1 million. Campaign spending inflation has been dramatic over the course of the last decade or so. The first House race to hit $1 million in spending was when Dave Albo had a re-elect in I believe it was either 2009 or 2007. Now House races regularly, competitive House races, break $1 million in spending on both sides. On the Senate race, if it's a competitive race, the odds are it's going to be $2-3 million per side in those races. During the most recent cycle in the House, the vast majority of the spending actually was on the Democratic side. The Democrats outspent the Republicans in most districts by a staggering amount. And in fact, one seat that the Republicans won, they were outspent 10-1. And that was in Tidewater in Hampton Roads, over in Hampton. Yeah, AC Cordoza, won a race that he was outspent in 10-1. But there was no competitive race, meaning within about 5 or 6 points, where the Republicans had a spending surplus. Although I'm sure we're optimistic about catching up this year. We have the governorship now, so hope springs eternal. But that's pretty much all I have to report to you as far as the progress on it. So aren't you sorry you didn't let Delegate Watts stay and take questions?
Thank you, Denise. We don't have any questions in chat. I don't know if you have any.
Linda's here. She's going to ask me one to save me. The home team's going to ask. Yes. Yeah.
There's still, there might be a couple, I don't know, I know there's at least one regarding trying to, I guess, whether it's disclosure or totally eliminate contributions from foreign agencies or entities.
It's actually it's actually a part of the law that isn't entirely clarified, but it should be, because you're not supposed to accept contributions from foreign entities in the United States for campaigns. And in fact, some of you may remember, this was probably about 10 or 11 years back. There was a controversy involving an Australian company that had purchased it might be the Downtown Expressway, but there's an Australian company that does tolling and roads, and they take over road maintenance. And they had purchased the rights to some of the tolling facilities in Virginia. I can't remember whether it was the Downtown Expressway or whether they got the contract for the tunnels over in Tidewater. But they had donated money to campaigns, and the campaigns didn't realize that it was an Australian company, and all of that money ended up getting refunded and returned. So they're not supposed to be doing it now, but I don't think a clarification of the law would hurt on foreign entities.
This bill that I had pulled up, I realize this is a House bill.
Sure.
But it's a House Bill 1648. The patron is Timothy Anderson.
Mhm.
I don't know where it is right now, but that's kind of one of the reasons I asked.
If the House defeats it, the argument they'll use is it's already illegal. But although it may already be illegal, it may not be spelled out that way in the code. And Delegate Anderson is a lawyer, so he probably knows whether it's spelled out that way in the code.
I was the answer.
Oh, of course. Linda is saving me here, since none of you in the chat saw fit to write anything down.
Let's do with the campaign advertising.
Mhm.
And I think it's Savola, Senator Savola,
Mhm.
that has a bill out there.
Is this a change to stand by your ad?
Yeah, I think she's asking in the bill for the disclosure of the top 3 donors to the campaign plan, if you will.
Like if a campaign, and I'll have to read the bill to make sure, but it sounds like as though if the campaign had predominant funders, let's say, that they would be disclosed in the campaign ad.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I don't know where that bill is either.
I can probably tell you where it's going. It may, but while all candidates have to disclose exactly where their funds come from, they don't have to advertise exactly where their funds come from, and they probably will. They will probably object to it. Our stand by your ad provisions in Virginia are, if they're followed, are actually pretty good. The challenge is enforcement. And as we all know, the State Board of Elections is not really a police authority. So as a result, enforcing some of these things becomes somewhat problematic. The State Board does have a portal where you can lodge a complaint when somebody does violate the stand by your ad provisions as far as disclosure. And they have issued fines and have been pretty good about doing so. But beyond that, we haven't seen a whole bunch.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. It's always a pleasure to be here. Fun group. Thank you, Linda, for bailing me out with a question.
And thank you so much for that honesty and, and telling the truth. Yes. So I suppose I just moved to Williamsburg 6 years ago, and certainly will learn to be direct. So as we're moving on, we are so fortunate to have the delegate from the 57th district, Delegate Sally Hudson, will come now and speak to us. Delegate Hudson.
I am here on Zoom Thank you so very much for letting me tune in this way while we are hopping back and forth on busy days in Richmond. For those of you I haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Sally Hudson, and I serve Charlottesville and Albemarle County in the House of Delegates. And I think I have been tasked today with talking about ranked choice voting, but I would love to share just a bit of optimism, I think, about campaign finance, just on the tail of that conversation you just heard. I see two things that give me some optimism about progress, not this session, but in the sessions ahead. I think that the arrival of fair districts next year will put some really meaningful pressure in a positive way on campaign finance reform. First off, because when the districts make sense, it's easier for voters to hold their delegates accountable, the delegates and senators, because it's easier to rally support from a community to hold their feet to the fire. And then the other piece is it makes it easier to run a community rooted campaign when your district makes sense. When you've got these crazy serpent districts that wiggle waggle all over these wild urban areas, it's much more difficult to get the water cooler effect of a community that's rooted around the same places and spaces going. And so you have to spend a lot more money on direct to voter advertising like mail and digital and TV, because the door knocking and the community organizing gets much harder. So I think that my hope is that we are about to turn the corner on campaign finance. I think that it's actually a real frustration that House Democrats outspent House Republicans 5-1 in the last election cycle and lost. I think that is sort of a sign of mismanagement on the money side, and it is causing House Democrats in a very good way to revisit tactics. So we have to start kind of stepping back from the arms race and asking what we're really getting for all of that money. But I'm an eternal optimist in that way. I think if you're on for office, you got to be. So those are my causes for bright lights up ahead on the finance front. As for ranked choice voting, we are also starting to turn some important corners in Virginia. And I see my colleague, Delegate Glass from Norfolk here. She has also been a real ally in this work. And so I'm glad to have her on as well. Just by way of history, because I know a lot of you have been by our side for every step of this, the ranked choice voting story in Virginia, at least at the General Assembly level, really starts back in 2020 with the passage of a bill that I carried that made it legal for local governing bodies, which means city councils and county boards, to hold ranked choice elections. That's an option that they could choose. Now, that bill passed in March 2020, and we all know what else happened in March 2020, which caused a lot of chaos for election administrators in particular. A lot of them were not super eager to roll out that brand new local option law right away because they had their hands full, not just with COVID, which made election administration very difficult, but also with implementing a lot of the other great ballot access laws that we passed in 2020, like early voting and all those pieces. So there was a lot on their plates, which meant it has taken some time for communities to start to take up the conversation of adoption. It was really in the late spring of 2020 when that got going in earnest, with Richmond's City Council starting to consider a ranked choice ballot measure, city council ordinance. That measure ultimately failed, but was a critical part of moving the conversation forward, because the existence of a real live official ordinance meant that the Department of Elections had to start preparing for its possible adoption. And so that was really got the Department of Elections going on the nuts and bolts of the technology side of doing ranked choice adoption, because it does take some investment in some software upgrades at the state level, at the local level, in coordination between them. So I think we owe a lot of thanks to the Richmond City Council and Catherine Jordan in particular, who spearheaded that measure, for their willingness to start the conversation, because that ordinance spurred a group of registrars and partners in technical assistance from across the country to start meeting regularly and troubleshooting those implementation details. The next big milestone was this last fall, in the fall of 2022, when the Arlington County Board took up their ordinance on adoption. And I know some of you are Arlington residents, and we have you to thank for being the first ones to officially cross the line and opt to be the first community that's going to hold ranked choice elections in their primaries in June for your county board races. So that is such a huge step. I think we have no reason to believe that those won't go well, but there is something something about doing it well on Virginia soil that will persuade other communities all across the country that it really can be done, that this is not something that's abstract, that happens in, faraway mystical lands like Minnesota and Maine, that this is something that can really happen in a very real way in our elections. So the question then is, what does the path forward look like from here? I know in the localities that I serve, Charlottesville and Albemarle County, we are doing our best to follow on your heels. In Charlottesville, we use a slightly different form of voting machines, different voting systems vendor than Arlington, which has made the software adoption pieces a little more complicated. So Charlottesville actually doesn't have the capacity to hold a ranked choice election in June, but they're shooting for November now for the general election. So there's a good chance that Seaville may make itself the number 2, and Albemarle County is as well. What I think what I have learned from that process of supporting my local communities in navigating this and in watching Arlington do it from afar is that one of the really key factors in success is a registrar who is enthusiastic about making the process go well. If you're an Arlington resident, your director of elections and registrar, Gretchen Schwagmeyer, is just fabulous and enthusiastic in particular about being intrepid, about exploring the parts of this that are new for us here in Virginia. And so if I were encouraging others of you about thinking about communities that might be ripe to join the next wave of adoption, I might start by thinking about where do you have allies in the local registrar, because ultimately they shoulder a lot of the work for doing it. And if the registrar is not enthusiastic, it can sour the local governing body on the prospect fairly quickly, because rightly, the local governing body members often want to defer to the local staff and say, hey, do we have what it takes to make this happen? And how sunny side up the registrar is about those prospects, I think can carry a lot of weight in whether the local governing body chooses to push forward with it or not. It can be a lot for the local elected leaders to try to sort of outpace the staff in whether or not they want to try something that's brand new. So where we go from here at the General Assembly level, I think there's sort of 2 big paths. The first sounds small, but I think it's sort of a big deal when it comes to clearing the bottlenecks in adoption. And that is that we need to expand the local option to include all local offices, not just local governing bodies, which very narrowly means city council and county board. All local offices would mean your school board members, and then also your constitutional officers, your Commonwealth's attorney, your treasurer, your commissioner of revenue. I have a bill that would do that this year, and I know that Delegate Glenn Davis from Virginia Beach has one that includes this provision as well. The reason that this matters so much is that the compromise that we struck in 2020 to get that bill out of the Senate narrowed the scope of the bill to just city councils and county boards. And I think reasonably there are local governments, including Richmond City, that have expressed some frustration or confusion about only being able to use those offices. They would rather switch to ranked choice at the local level for all offices at the same time. That way they don't have to explain to voters why the way that they're voting for their city councilors is different from the way that they're voting for their school board members. You can surely understand if you're in a community that has multiple at-large candidates, that it would be easier to do all of them at the same time. So though that bill is small in scope and maybe doesn't include all of our dreams for what ranked choice could one day be in Virginia, it's a very practical thing that we can do to clear one of the major bottlenecks that we hear from communities that are considering adoption. So if this is something that you'd like to see scaled up to higher offices and you can be enthusiastic about advocating for this incremental change, I really do think that it'll help us get more communities on board. And then in both the House and Senate, with both Democratic and Republican patrons, there's also a bigger bill that would allow for ranked choice voting in 2024 presidential primaries, which would be a pretty big step for Virginia if we only right now in 2023 have one community that is committed for sure for doing it at the local level. I'm all aboard in principle in the sense that I would love to see the option of ranked choice voting up and down the ballot. I think the jury's still out, or the committee's still out as to whether they would be willing to take that step. I tend to think that the next most reasonable option that we might see would be for ranked choice in primaries at the congressional level, since Republicans in Northern Virginia have clearly shown their willingness to do that more informally using their conventions. Both the Virginia 10th and Virginia 11th chose their nominees for 2022 using ranked choice in a convention kind of setting, or a firehouse primary. And so if by 2024 we could let congressional districts do it, which is bigger than a locality, but not quite statewide, then I think that could be a great step. I also think that a really reasonable but bigger goal to shoot for might be statewide election primaries in 2025, given that Republicans in 2021 used it to nominate our current governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. So I think that we should still be kicking for those long-term goalposts. I think exactly how we get there is still a conversation for the General Assembly. But I think that anybody who's talking to their local electeds about ranked choice, about why ranked choice is in general very good for democracy and the inclusion of both more voters and more candidates, I think that's all to the good. There's a question in the chat about from Mary about whether one of the problems with implementing RCV is the software cost. The good news to that about that question is the answer is no. One of the major steps that the State Department of Elections has recently taken is working with the National Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center to secure a statewide contract for their ballot tabulation software, which they make available open source and at no cost. And there is some cost on the localities of the software that they need at the local level to scan the ballots to read them, but it's not that expensive. It's somewhere on the order of maybe $10,000, which, you know, relative to the costs of many hundreds of thousands of people is not a huge deal. It's also the case that these days, most modern software upgrades and hardware upgrades include ranked choice capacity by default. And so all of the communities are going to have to go in this direction eventually. It's kind of like updating your phone. You get told when the next version is coming down, and it may include all sorts of whiz bangs that you don't want to use, but it's coming your way whether you like it or not.
Okay.
The question Carolyn had was whether the registrar's organization is supportive. Not yet. I think in general, you may have discovered that the registrars can be cautious about anything that makes more work for them, and most changes make more work. So we're not quite there in terms of their support.
This has been very informative. And thank you so much, Delegate Hudson. As a proud graduate of Albemarle High School, I'm so glad to see you. That's right. I didn't say which year, but I was there. And before I introduce our next delegate, someone with Jay Newell, who is president of the Richmond League, wanted to say thank you for coming all the way down from Charlottesville to Richmond to help out to support ranked choice voting.
Oh,
So
thank you.
Thank you.
It's a passion project for me, so I'll travel wherever that work goes.
Thank you. And our next delegate of the 89th district herself is also very passionate about ranked choice voting, and that is Delegate Jackie Glass.
Hey there, thank you, Deb. I don't have much time. I'm going to be brief because I think I'm shifted a little bit. But I think Sally said much of what sort of needs to be said. I think the question we have to ask ourselves, particularly with the ranked choice voting, is what do we owe our future? Because we're right now living in a really pivotal time, and in where it stands, it's like this unwritten sort of influence that we can have on this moment of being able to have ranked choice voting at our feet. I look at this as an opportunity to sort of imagine how we like not the selective we, because our current voting system is definitely the selective we, but the collective we can sort of put our electoral systems on the right course. Because the fact of the matter is as we look at our system as it stands, whether it's Washington or Virginia, is broken. Like, and part of it is that we quite frankly have career politicians that are not getting the job done. And so we see the consequences of the political sort of corruption and things like that as it pertains to voting, only having to get their little 30% and being able to win. So I think the only way to fix the people is to fix the system. And that's why we need this electoral reform. This is why ranked choice voting is so important. And quite frankly, you're asking the politicians here, present company included, we're consenting victims, right? You're asking us to consent. So I could see why some of them cringe when they hear people like myself and Sally saying this is the way forward, because we're asking them to continue to work. But we need to sort of put and I don't want to be like hyper, like, yeah, country, but we need to put our country ahead of our party and our and put people first, because that's what this does. It's really not politics. It's just a common sense approach. And I guess I shouldn't say common sense, because common sense is relative, but it's a responsible thing to do. It's the responsible thing for us to do, because if we're going to do the ABCs of governance, I believe that's accountability, boldness, and coalition building. We have to do have ABCD representation, which is representation that goes above and beyond the call of duty. And so I see this as a real opportunity for us. Choice, I think when we're talking about ranked choice voting, we can move at the speed of trust, because like Sally just said, it's getting the registrars to buy in, because we're asking them to do more, because not only is it the cost or the small cost of just making sure we're ready for these types of elections, it's an educational piece. They'll be responsible for helping educate the public on how a thing like this could work, the cost associated with that. But if we're looking at choice, if we're looking at voice, and we're looking at power that belongs to voters, then this is essentially the right thing to do. I've seen very many other approaches that afford us the opportunity to really have a more representative leadership. And I just can't say it again. We can't fix some of these people, but we can fix the system. And so that's where I believe ranked choice voting puts us. Sally already put in the chat Fair Vote Virginia. Like, that is a Fair Vote Virginia is a really great resource as well if you're interested in more information. Caroline just said it. I mean, we know I can put 3 candy bars in front of my kids and say, all right, rank your choices. They can do that, right? That's actually a little test that Fair Vote does with folks. Rank your favorite candy bars, and we'll get the candy bar that most of the room wants. So when we sort of put this into terms of like, it's something we do already, even if we say we don't do it, we do it with our kids. Who's our favorite kid? Ranking them. But really, it's a real easy way. And I'm grateful for you all's advocacy, and I look forward to sort of being a part of that, because we do have some resistance within the legislature. Again, I will say this again, consenting victims. There are a lot of folks that don't want this, because they're going to have to work for those votes. And I think that's what you guys expect us to do. They're going to have to build coalitions. They're going to have to work with people that don't necessarily have the same ideologies as them, but can find some common ground. And I think it's the right way forward. And I don't know if there's anything else I can say other than what Sally said, but please advocate for these bills coming forward. If you can, you guys always, like, I'm on privileges and elections, and I know that League of Women Voters always shows up for or against. Like, you guys always have representation in place, and it matters. So as we continue to take these steps, we look forward to you helping us get the community's buy-in on how this could be really, really weary. And I'll say this lastly, as I've been doing this work, I recognize, particularly in the Black community, there's a lot of distrust towards changing the system, like a lot of it. And I say that out loud because we've got some folks in Norfolk working on it, and it's 2 white men. And I remind them every day that there's going to be some work that needs to happen in communities across the board, because there's distrust in any change to the system, because especially as it pertains to voting. So as we do sort of advocacy, I'm urging you all to make the advocates for this, to bring advocates in that look like your community as a whole, whatever that is, making sure that it is a collective effort, because it's not just a thing that's good for one brand of folks, it's good for all of us.
Well, we appreciate that charge to get out there and make sure that we advocate in our own communities in reference to ranked choice voting. And thanks for bringing it up. I know I've fielded a lot of questions about it in the African-American community, you know, for people, what? You want us to do what? You kind of thing. But
Yeah.
I really appreciate the fact that you are reminding us what it's really all about and increasing the voice and your power and having to make politicians, a few of them who don't like to, but actually work to earn the trust of the people they're supporting. Thank you so much, Delegate Glass.
Thank you,
For
guys.
that. Thank you. Our next speaker almost needs no introduction from some of us who were taking some of the ranked choice voting seminars online. She is now the executive director of Upvote. That is Liz White. Take it away.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for having me. I recognize most of your faces, and of course, always love to participate in anything the league invites me to. So I am Liz White. I am the executive director of Upvote Virginia. And I want to take one moment because I'm also here to talk about ranked choice voting, and Delegates Hudson and Glass have done such a good job that I'm gonna, okay, should I keep talking? So I'm gonna take a moment just to say who Upvote Virginia is. We are the new iteration of One Virginia 2021, and anyone who is anywhere near the league knows about redistricting reform and our movement last decade, and knows One Virginia 2021. You all were one of our most valuable partners in that movement. So now that there are new districts, now that the redistricting cycle is done for the decade, we were faced with the choice. We were faced with the choice of either saying, okay, we did it, and folding our statewide network that we had built and taking our ball and going home. Or we could kind of take this really incredible network of people like you and steer the ship to other democracy reforms. And that's what we opted to do, was relaunch. And so we relaunched in August as Upvote Virginia. We're a completely new organization we broadened our mission. So instead of a narrow focus on redistricting, we are democracy reform. Basically, what is good for Virginia voters is kind of our guiding principle. And our first flagship issue that we've chosen is ranked choice voting. We are clearly, as you've seen, in excellent company in this movement. And I wanted to talk a little bit. Delegates Hudson and Glass covered so much of what is going on in session and in Virginia with ranked choice voting right now. But I do want to talk about some of the thought process in us jumping into the ranked choice voting space, and also more specifics about what's going on this session. So I think in addition to what's been said about why ranked choice voting is important and why it would be good for Virginia, Virginia also is in a really pivotal place in the national conversation and in its own conversation. Nationally, a lot of democracy reforms, including ranked choice voting, get painted with a partisan brush, get painted with a progressive brush, and people get very wary and they say, well, obviously this is good for somebody. Who's this good for? Maybe not my team, and they get resistant to change. In Virginia, both parties in completely separate ways have embraced ranked choice voting so far. I think Delegate Hudson mentioned the statewide primary, the nominating contest on the Republican side for the statewide offices. They also used ranked choice voting in their nominating contests in 3 congressional districts this year, the 8th, the 10th, and the 11th, as well as the special election just last month in the 4th district. And then the Democrats, you see Arlington, which is it's pretty dark blue, and they are, the pioneers in this local adoption. And Delegate Hudson's bill from 2020 passed almost along party lines. So again, both parties moving toward the use of this policy in different ways. But we really have this unique opportunity to bring both parties together on a issue that has the added benefit of being really good for Virginia voters. So here is what I'm going to just elaborate a little bit on the bills. I know Delegate Hudson touched on them. Her bill, I think, is in the chat, but she's got HB 2118. And then the Delegate Davis bill that Delegate Hudson mentioned is HB 1751. And then there are identical twins in the House and the Senate, Republican Delegate Rob Bloxham in the House and Democratic Senator Creed Deeds in the Senate have identical bills that just address presidential primaries. They spell out a lot of logistical information, which is very helpful for all of us election nerds. But mostly all it says is that the parties have the option to use ranked choice voting in their presidential primaries going forward. It is a big swing. Delegate Hudson is correct. I mean, right, we're talking about, we really hope these localities will adopt it for city council elections. Oh, also the top office in the country. But it makes sense when you think about it. This big swing is a really practical step. And there's a couple reasons why that I wanted to go through. It's a really easy narrative for voter education. It is a single winner election. It is certainly in recent history, a very crowded field. Ranked choice voting makes a lot of sense in an election like that. People also emotionally connect to a presidential primary in ways that they don't, maybe the everyday voter maybe doesn't connect to a local race or a congressional race. People get invested, and that helps us as advocates take the conversation out of just the hypothetical and academic into something people really get jazzed about and enthusiastic about. It also is a quick way to get a lot of people to use ranked choice voting immediately, right? Even if there isn't a primary on the left in 24, the Republican primary in 2016 had 1 million voters, over 1 million Virginians voted in that election. So even if that is just the same number in 2024, that's 1 million Virginians who've now participated in a ranked choice voting election. And we know from every exit poll around the country that people who use ranked choice voting understand it and like it, and they want to use it more and again, and they want to see it in other places as well. So 1 million Virginians who suddenly go, oh, that was easy. And that was, I feel heard. This is great. All the benefits of RCV are true. That's suddenly 1 million people who can look at their neighbor and say, oh, no, it's fine. RCV is fine. It's not scary. Virginia also votes pretty late in the process, right? We're a Super Tuesday state. And that means, especially as we expand early voting and more people take advantage of that, that means the odds that you vote for someone, maybe even just a few days before the election, who then drops out of the race before your vote is counted, those are pretty good odds. In 2016, over 11,000 Virginia votes were just put in the proverbial trash can because they were cast for someone not in the race. We're not even talking long shot candidates. We're talking they are not in the race. They cannot receive your vote. Your vote did not count. It was about 1% of the votes cast, and there was about 1.7 million votes nationally. And then, of course, in 2020, we have expanded early voting and absentee voting and COVID. So that issue, blew up. Over 3 million votes nationally were put in that proverbial trash can. And it's over 30,000 votes in Virginia. It was over 2%. So 1 in 50 ballots cast did not count. With RCV, you can vote on the first day of early voting. You can go down your list of everyone you find acceptable for that office. And when it comes time to count that vote, they will go down your list until there's someone they can count your vote for. And that way, your ballot counts exactly the same as someone who walked into the voting booth on election day with all of the relevant information. No more votes in the trash can. So that's a big, noticeable benefit of ranked choice voting in a presidential large-scale election. The other bonus for localities of passing a presidential preference bill is that if there's a statewide election, then elect needs to make sure that everybody's voting equipment and software is capable of doing an RCV election. So all of a sudden, the financial burden shifts a little bit off the localities. And as we continue our advocacy on the local level, the fiscal impact isn't a factor anymore. They can just make those decisions based on whether they think that policy is good for their community. That is all I have. For those of you in the room, I have little ranked choice voting cards. think it was Carolyn who said it's easier to explain than new districts. And if this is helpful to you, please, I have a million of them. You are welcome to them. Anyone who's on Zoom, you can reach out via our website or hello@upvoteva.org. I will send you any materials you need.
Just send them, Liz, just
Yeah.
send them to me. This is Joan. Just send
Oh,
them to
okay.
me. I'll put them in the drive.
Joan will have them.
Okay.
And Chris, thank you for putting that in the link. I was not watching the chat, so I don't know if there's any questions, but thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you so much. And a whole lot of us who took those ranked choice voting little videos you all had online, really appreciate it. And right now, continuing on with the theme of ranked choice voting, we're going to have our own Chris DeRosa come and tell us about that some more. Thank you.
Well, you heard pretty much everything you would want to know at this point from Delegate Glass, Delegate Hudson, and Liz White. I'm Chris DeRosa. I'm a member of the Arlington Alexandria League. I am also a member of Upvote Virginia's board. And I serve, I think, as temporary lead for the Virginia League's issues subgroup on ranked choice voting. What I want to do is just very briefly tell you that the state league's position, as updated in 2021, states that the league supports the implementation of ranked choice voting as an alternative to plurality voting. So plurality voting, you know, is the whoever gets the most votes, whether it's like, it could be just 38% of the voters voted for that candidate, but if that's higher than everybody else, that person declared the winner. So that might mean that 63% of the voters didn't vote for that candidate, and yet we have that as our elected official. Furthermore, the league supports the expanded use of ranked choice voting in state-run primaries, as well as other local elections, both single and multi-winner. So this mirrors the National League's 2021 position statement in support of alternative electoral methods. Both the state and national leagues noted that education of voters is very important and that funding should be available. So in continuing and supporting the league's position or mission of empowering voters and defending democracy, ranked choice voting would help us to reach that mission. And as Delegate Glass said, ranked choice voting would give us choice, voice, and power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And rounding us out is our own Trish Schwagmeyer. I hope I said it right, but please make the correction.
Yep.
Who's going to talk to, beg your pardon?
You're absolutely correct.
Oh, thank you. You're so kind. And so she's going to talk to us now and round it back to campaign finance. Thank you.
I think we sort of have the gist already of what's happened and what's happened this session already, given the Senate P&E meeting yesterday. And you might also want to know that these failures to pass legislation that would control the amount of money coming into campaigns or control how legislators are able to use their campaign funds. These bills have been coming around for over 20 years, and the league supports them every time, and they get shot down every session too. There's one bill I want to mention that is still alive. It's actually a set of 3 bills. And what this would do is make a fundamental change in the code. So the code currently has no ban on personal use of campaign funds. Someone who, as long as they're running an active campaign, can use those campaign funds essentially in any way they want to, and nothing is illegal. They can use it to pay for their college tuition or pay off their student loan debts or pay their mortgage. There's nothing illegal. So this new bill, it's HB 1826, SB 1471, and HB 1552 would ban personal use of campaign funds. And it also would, for the first time, put in Virginia code a list of the ways it's legally permitted for you to use those funds. So it really would make a difference in the code and the way things have been done if we can get it passed. It almost passed last year. This was a bill that the Joint Subcommittee to Study Comprehensive Campaign Reform in 2021 worked very hard to make this bill and craft it. It almost made it through last year and then was killed in the House P&E committee. The Joint Subcommittee, by the way, did not meet this last fall at all, even though it was supposed to. So the versions you have now are very similar to the version that came out of that original Joint Subcommittee work. So those three bills, it's personal use, and also the list of acceptable uses of campaign funds. Thanks.
Awesome. Trish, thank you so much for your work. And I would note that Trish is on the study group that is working on a campaign finance reform position for the league that will be voted on at our convention in June. Also want to mention next week, we are live in person, downtown Richmond. We're in the auditorium of the Truist building on the 4th floor. So please join us. There is no virtual option next week. We want you here. We want you loud and proud and wearing your purple for the league. And reach out to your presidents, find out if there are any meetings scheduled with your legislators. And if not, reach out to Denise for help in getting those scheduled. So I think Joan has the link in the chat for League Day. You do need to register. There is a breakfast included in that. And I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank the people from our leagues in Richmond and Williamsburg and Fairfax for being here in person today. And next week, I hope we have all of our leagues represented. So thanks again and have a great day.